Okay. Where's the slides? Okay. Oh, okay, here we are. Is this on? Okay, good. Hi, thank you. Is it not working? Sound? Hi. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's really great to be part of this, seminar on legal capacity. So my talk is titled The Abolition of Coercive Paternalistic State Interventions in the Lives of People with Disabilities. And I'm going to focus quite a bit on forced psychiatric interventions as an instance of that, but I think it's important to see the general case that guardianship, as well as non-consensual interventions in mental health settings, are both instances of coercive paternalistic intervention by the state in the lives of people with disabilities. So it's coercive, it's against the person's will, it's paternalistic, it's being said to be in the person's own best interest, which is in itself a contradiction. Usually something that's done to us against our will is not something that we would experience as being in our interest. And it's intervention by the state or justified by the state. So guardianship, you can see, is an intervention by the state that takes away the person's rights, restricts the person's decision-making, and forced psychiatric interventions is an intervention either directly by the public mental health authorities or authorized by the state under a mental health law or some other law of the state, or that's tolerated by the state for these private actors to do, okay? And both guardianship and the whole regime of forced psychiatric interventions, including involuntary committals to a psychiatric facility, as well as involuntary treatment, the administration of drugs or electroshock, the use of restraints against the administration of drugs or electroshock against the person's will, the use of restraints or solitary confinement. These are both called substitute decision-making regimes by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So according to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, forced psychiatric interventions violate Article 12 as well as Article 14 of the CRPD. I had included some slides on the Brazilian laws that were coming after that, and they didn't appear, so this must be the original, not the revised version. But I'll tell you that Brazil's mental health law provides for 3 ways people can be admitted into a psychiatric facility. One is voluntary by the person's choice. One is involuntary by the, I can't remember the details. One is by, I believe, by a court, and one is by the medical professionals. Both those last 2 are against the person's will. That's clearly contrary to the CRPD, and as we've seen, it's contrary to Article 12. So in addition to the reform of the Civil Code and the inclusion law, there needs to be reform of the mental health law to abolish those provisions. I think they may be trying to get the correct presentation up. There are provisions in Brazil's inclusion law. There are actually some contradictory provisions that contradict themselves. So you will see that the inclusion law, as people have said, provides that guardianship cannot take care of the person's health issues, only the financial issues of the person, right? We've seen that in the other presentations. Let's see if No, it's still not there. So in any case, there are some contradictory provisions in the law of inclusion. There are some provisions that appear to say that there can be no interventions without the person's own free and informed consent on persons with disabilities. However, there is still a provision for emergency interventions in the health field. I don't know to what extent the mental health field in this country is relying on emergency health powers. I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. But in any case, I think we can see that there's a possibility that aspects of the law of inclusion are contradicting the mental health law, and the activists and lawyers can explore to what extent that can be used, and to what extent there are still loopholes existing in the law of inclusion that still allow forced psychiatric interventions in the statute. And then, of course, we would have to see how the courts are interpreting this. It's not coming. It's still not coming. Now I don't know where the rest of my presentation is. Let's see. Yeah. They are changing it. Okay. Is it there? Okay, thank you. I believe it's still, they're changing it now. Okay, all right. I'll just go on so as not to waste all the time. So to go into some of the background of why forced interventions or state paternalistic coercive interventions by the state violate the right to legal capacity, we can talk about the right to self-determination and self-defense. So it's been said, and I actually recall Gerard Quinn, Professor Gerard Quinn from Ireland saying this, that legal capacity is both the positive right to say yes and the negative right to say no. It contains an affirmative right, I want to get married, I want to go and sign a contract to buy this house, and it also creates a right to prevent other people from crossing my boundaries. And I think this, the positive and the negative of legal capacity, is also actually a very strongly feminist value, right? We know from feminism, we have the positive right to say yes to whatever kind of sexual or romantic relationships we truly desire with another mutually consenting adult, and we have the absolute right to draw a boundary and say, I don't want this, and moreover, you don't have the right to even try to push your attentions on me in an aggressive way, okay? And I think that same paradigm, when I was working on the CRPD, those were the feminist values that I was bringing to the question of the right to be free from all forced psychiatric interventions. The same way as a woman, I refuse any kind of attention sexually or in my personal space wanted. The same way okay, now it's all going through there. The same way I have the same right to protect my body, to protect my physical and mental integrity against the intrusion by unwanted drugs that are going to transform my mind. That's an aggression against my body and my consciousness. Okay, so that's the mental health law. I've copied it in the original, so you can see the two different involuntary and compulsory interventions, contrary to the CRPD. The inclusion law says that a person with disability cannot be obligated to submit to forced treatment or institutionalization. But then it says, if you're in a situation of guardianship, the consent can be supplied according to the law. What does that mean? because then Article 85 says that guardianship cannot apply in the area of health. So that seems to be a contradiction. A Brazilian lawyer here has acknowledged to me that, yes, this does appear to be a contradiction. Also, another paragraph on free and informed consent says that in a situation of guardianship, the consent of the person should be assured to the greatest possible extent. But then, what does that mean, to the greatest possible extent? And then, what are they doing? In what kind of situations are they saying it's not possible? And then finally, that provision on the cases of a risk of death or a health emergency. And I'm going to talk some about the emergency situation, because that's also, that's an important aspect that still needs to be addressed. Okay. Free and informed consent in healthcare is a fundamental human right that demonstrates both the positive and the negative aspects of legal capacity. Positive in the sense of, I have a right to consent to the health interventions that I want. If I'm a woman, I might want to have an abortion, and the state might want to deny me the right to consent to that. And if I'm a woman with a psychosocial disability, I want to have the right to not have drugs or electroshock put into my body that are going to harm me, that somehow some psychiatrist thinks that's the greatest thing to do to me, but he may not want to do it to himself, right? Okay, so the aspect of free and informed consent to health is a civil right because it relates to the integrity of the person. And we have also promoted that that forced psychiatric interventions, forced medical treatment, particularly in relation to attacking an aspect of a person that the person feels personally that they don't want to change, is an act of torture. I have analyzed this. I've written a paper. I'm not going to go into details about this, but I think it's important to note that that aspect of free and informed consent, despite being part of the right to health, should be understood as a civil right. In the recently adopted African Protocol on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they include this under the article on the freedom from torture and other ill treatment. And I believe in the Brazilian law of inclusion, it's actually framed in a similar way, that there's a right to not be submitted against your will to medical or scientific experimentation or to treatment. So that's very progressive. Okay, I think I'm going to skip some of these details. In order for states to comply with the CRPD and abolish forced psychiatric interventions, we need to understand that psychosocial disability is not an illness. And that's really the way that it has been promoted. It's been promoted, some people call it a medical model or a biological model. And it's actually completely false. It has no scientific basis whatsoever. There is no blood test, there is no brain pathology that corresponds to any psychiatric diagnosis. If there were, it would be a neurological diagnosis and not a psychological one. And it may be that some psychiatric diagnoses actually also are neurological, but the ones that most people think of as mental illnesses, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, the diagnosis of bipolar, there is absolutely no scientific evidence that it's a brain abnormality. And in fact, those diagnostic labels are extremely controversial. It's doubtful what they mean. I was labeled schizophrenic one week, and then the next week they labeled me depressed. And the difference was I was in a facility that targeted mostly poor people the first week and more middle-class people the second week. That was the only difference, okay? And they wanted to give me neuroleptic drugs. That's what schizophrenia meant. I think it's really important to depathologize experiences of intense, what I'm calling intense psychic suffering or psychic openness. Those are the kinds of things that typically get called mental illness, mental disorder, psychosocial disability. It's important to depathologize entirely, not just to get rid of the medical, the purely medical model, but to take these experiences out of the realm of some professional person needing to decide what's wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with us. It's about what the person is experiencing and person-to-person interaction. How can I interact with you? How can we actually communicate in this situation of this very difficult thing that you're going through? So I think the depathologizing is essential in order to provide the right kind of support, to provide support that really gets a person through a difficult situation. I have been in situations with friends where a person is starting to talk and act in a way that I start to think, oh no, I'm afraid somebody's going to try and put them in a psychiatric institution. But in that same situation, when they are in a situation where they can talk and be understood and figure out what's going on, the whole situation dissolves. So psychosocial disability is a disability that is not there. It's a disability that it's only there when it kind of forms out of the social situation of barriers, and that it can completely disappear when the person is actually understood and when the person understands for themselves, okay, this is what's going on, now I can go on with my life. And it's also, the depathologizing is also essential to prohibit and prevent the misuse of emergency health powers to initiate forced psychiatric interventions. So we did see that emergency health powers in the Brazilian law. To the CRPD, this is the general approach to emergency. So first of all, according to general comment number 1, people with disabilities, which is essentially all people, really, all people retain their legal capacity to make decisions at all times, including in crisis situations. So the term crisis, I would say, includes both crisis of a psychosocial nature or even of a purely social nature. If I lose my home, I'm in a crisis situation. And it also could include health emergencies. You know, if, God forbid, you get into an accident and you know, you're unconscious and you actually need medical attention to save your life. Okay. If it's not possible in a medical emergency, and I'm saying not psychiatric, I'm saying a genuine medical emergency when you're bleeding, you're unconscious, your life is at risk from things that are not within the realm of your own behavior or your will to control, okay? If it's not possible in a medical emergency to determine the person's will and preferences, medical personnel should be authorized to make a best interpretation and, if necessary, to follow a default protocol of saving the person's life and health. I'm not sure if that latter part is really yet I don't think the CRPD committee has considered it to that extent, but I think it's reasonable to have a default protocol in medical emergencies that if the person, say, does not have some alert on them saying, I do not want such and such treatment, that the medical personnel should be empowered to save the person's life. I don't think that should be controversial. But in a psychiatric, what they call a psychiatric emergency, it's really a psychosocial crisis. Nobody is going to bleed to death because they're extremely agitated, running up and down, tearing off their clothes. They're not going to die from it, okay? And that should never be treated as a medical emergency under the powers of medical personnel to intervene and make a default, take default measures to save the person's life and health. I think it's also important to point out that in those situations, the person is engaging. They may not want to engage with you, but not wanting to engage with you, they may not want to answer a question, but they have a right to refuse to answer your questions, and that should not be deemed that they are incapable of expressing their will. I think we have to understand that sometimes refusal to speak, can be an expression of will. We all might do that. We might be annoyed with somebody. A doctor wants to ask me something. I don't want to talk to you, and I might be upset for some reason. I might not want to even tell them that I don't want to talk to them, but still, if I'm refusing, I am expressing my will and preferences in that particular way. Okay, so situations that have been treated as psychiatric emergencies need to be reframed as psychosocial crisis situations, not medical. We need to, it may require support and accommodations for the person to get through the crisis according to their own will and preferences. There are many, many practices being developed now throughout the world, and I'm sure there are some good ones in Brazil that I'm going to learn about when I meet with some people in a few days. There's many practices that are being developed to interact with people in really difficult states of consciousness and explore with them what their will and preferences are and what their needs are to get through the immediate situation and to go further, to figure out what they want to do in their lives. Sometimes a person may need support in a more long-term way or in an intermittent way. But I think it's important also to not think of advanced directives, advanced planning as that's the answer to support for people with psychosocial disabilities. There's always going to be a first time that is not anticipated. For some people, the first time is going to be the only time. So we can't rely on this notion of advanced directives. We have to develop the adequate crisis response. And that's an aspect of support for people with psychosocial disabilities and exercising legal capacity that I don't think it hasn't been looked at in the framework of support in any projects that I know of. And I've actually advocated that if anyone wants to do an interesting project, that's one that I think would have merit. And it's important to get rid of the coercive interventions. I think that if there can be a pilot project done where you're providing crisis support within a CRPD framework, one of the things you have to do is get rid of the coercive interventions as part of it. Get rid of the threat. If there's the threat hanging over the person that, if I don't come up with a good way out of this situation with these great people who are trying to support me, they're going to take me away. And I know they're going to take me away. If there's that threat, for some people, the good support in the crisis is not going to be enough. I sometimes can imagine myself in that situation, and it might not do it for me. Okay, so getting back to this principle, coercive paternalistic state interventions that must be abolished according to the CRPD. Article 12 prohibits the use of the best interest principle in any determination regarding adults. That's according to the CRPD committee in general comment number 1. Mental health legislation is one example, as I said, of coercive paternalistic state intervention in the lives of people with disabilities. The state authorizes public and private actors to deprive individuals of their liberty and act against their bodily integrity. I think I said this, these acts amount to arbitrary detention and torture. And I think if we look at these acts from the perspective of people with disabilities, or simply from a neutral perspective that is not trying to look from a clinical standpoint or from a standpoint that seeks to justify them, I think it's actually pretty clear that it's horrifying. It's an act of arbitrary detention. You don't necessarily know why they're taking you away. You didn't do anything wrong, you know? You didn't do anything against the law, and all of a sudden somebody is taking you away and putting you in some place where they lock you away. So the CRPD committee and the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention have both recognized that deprivation of liberty in the mental health setting is arbitrary detention. So that's contrary to Article 14 of the CRPD in addition to Article 12. In addition, there may be other mechanisms in a society whereby the state can intervene in the lives of people with disabilities or other groups in a situation of vulnerability. In some countries, like I think Ireland actually, they have adult protection measures that allow the courts to do that. Now, I would say that such measures are all going to violate Article 12 if they entail coercion, because you're authorizing agents of the state to take action against adults in their supposed best interest. Sometimes it's going to be explicitly discriminatory based on disability, but in any case, I think it's going to be contrary to Article 12, even if it's not explicitly linked to disability, because it relies on that best interest principle. To conclude, unless we address and eliminate coercive paternalistic interventions by the state in the lives of people with disabilities, including eliminating those provisions in the mental health law, any legal capacity reform will be incomplete. This entails depathologizing psychosocial crisis and psychosocial disability and removing these experiences from medical hegemony. In other words, to reframe the concept of mental illness and disorder to understand what has been mental illness or disorder as instead psychosocial disability or psychosocial crisis that does not depend on medical diagnosis, that gets us completely out of that biopsychosocial that you heard this morning. We're taking ourselves out of the bio and out of the evaluation, and we're just talking about psychosocial and experiences of people that do not need professional evaluation in order to be validated, in order to receive support and accommodations, in order to be fully respected as human beings and claim all of our rights. I thank you very much for listening. I've got some links to the site and my email for contact, so thank you.
Ok, nós temos alguns instantes para perguntas e respostas. Duas perguntas, já temos ali uma pergunta para ser feita. Por favor. Tem ali a...
Olá, a minha pergunta é para a Tina. Tina, você e a sua organização me ajudaram muito no trabalho como defensora pública há anos atrás, e foi uma enorme surpresa conhecê-la aqui. Eu vinha para o seminário e não sabia da sua ligação, enfim, com o centro, E aí eu queria colocar como foi a sua ajuda virtual, sem você saber o seu trabalho, e pedir mais uma ajuda. Em 2011, mais ou menos, eu como defensora pública, comecei a trabalhar com duas realidades, que são duas realidades dramáticas no Brasil. A primeira delas são pessoas moradoras de hospitais psiquiátricos há décadas. Existem muitas, inclusive aqui no estado de São Paulo. Algumas delas até sem registro de nascimento, sem nome formal, né? Isso é um drama em pleno século XXI, num estado rico como São Paulo e pelo país inteiro, que é o que nós chamamos de pessoas moradoras de hospitais psiquiátricos. Então, uma das frentes de trabalho que eu tive foi na desativação desses hospitais que ainda existem, né? Aliás, muito proximamente de São Paulo, em Sorocaba, esses hospitais foram desativados, eram 7 de 2011 até agora. Então, foi um trabalho bem sucedido, digamos assim, com várias entidades, vários parceiros, porque esse trabalho é sempre assim, né? Com muitos apoios e muitas pessoas. Uma outra frente de trabalho é pessoas em situação de rua que fazem uso abusivo de drogas. Para essas pessoas, em geral, ainda a cultura é acreditar na internação forçada como uma forma de tratamento, às vezes como a única forma de tratamento, né? Ainda essa cultura vem sendo quebrada, mas ainda é muito sólida no Brasil. E fazendo a defesa dessas pessoas, a primeira lei que eu me deparei é a lei da proteção a pessoas com transtorno mental, sofrimento mental, que é a lei 10.216 de 2001, brasileira, que veda a discriminação, mas permite 3 tipos de internação. Ela permite a internação forçada e não fala onde, não fala por quanto tempo, não fala como a pessoa sairá. É uma lei aclamada como um avanço, porém muito contraditória, como em geral acontece no Brasil com as leis, né? Nessa área em específico. E aí eu fui ler a convenção na época e falei, eu vou puxar a convenção da ONU para eliminar as contradições da lei e falar que a forma coercitiva de tratamento é proibida. Então, eu chamo a convenção para também ser aplicada a pessoas que fazem uso abusivo de drogas e a pessoas com sofrimento mental, com transtorno mental. Que, pelo que eu entendi, é o que se fala e que você fala bastante como a deficiência psicossocial, né? Se eu entendi certo. E aí, eu escrevi e falei muito sobre isso, sobre aplicar a convenção, e os únicos textos que eu achei foram da sua organização, do seu centro. Existe muito pouca coisa escrita e dita sobre essa interpretação que protege, que amplia o leque de proteção e que protege as pessoas com transtorno mental e uso abusivo de drogas. E de 2011 até hoje, no meio jurídico é muito difícil convencer as pessoas de que é necessário incluir esses 2 grupos no conceito de pessoa com deficiência, né? Então eu queria, inclusive, entre defensores eu não consigo fazer esse convencimento. A deficiência é uma coisa, transtorno mental é outra coisa, uso abusivo de drogas é outra coisa. Eu enfrento muito esses conceitos como se fossem óbvios, né? E pelo que eu entendi da sua fala e de todo o seu trabalho, se inclui para proteger. Então, eu queria que você explicasse mais no seu conceito, por favor, o conceito de deficiência psicossocial e que materiais eu poderia ter acesso e como fazer essa ponte para explicar melhor para o sistema de justiça esse conceito que amplia a proteção. Por favor.
Is this going to be on? Okay. Okay, we got that. Thanks. I should have kept it. Okay, so I think that you're asking about two populations. One is people who are drug addicted or drug users, and the other is people who have been institutionalized for a long time and remain in the psychiatric hospitals. I think with reference to people who are addicted to drugs, I think that can be understood as psychosocial disability. I'm not sure it universally is understood as psychosocial disability. I think clearly when they're using the mental health law, if they're using the mental health law against those people, then then the state or the system is treating it as psychosocial disability, right? Because I would presume the mental health law, like all modern mental health laws, says that you can only be taken if there's a psychiatric diagnosis or some mental disorder that's applied to you. So that is something that I think is clear. The way we understand psychosocial disability, one aspect of it is actual or perceived. And the CRPD committee has accepted that if someone gives you a psychiatric diagnosis, if someone says you have a mental disorder, on that basis, I am taking you and locking you away and forcibly treating you, you're a person with psychosocial disability for purposes of the CRPD. In terms of the experience of what it is to be using drugs habitually or to be addicted, it's not an experience that I can really speak to. I think to the extent that it relates to the person's psychic distress in some way, and that it relates to altered consciousness and a sense of dependency, I think there's a good argument to say that it is a psychosocial disability. But I don't know. I think there's issues that could go different ways on it. But clearly, if they're being treated as people with psychosocial disabilities under the mental health law, then they should have the rights under the convention. I mean, that's the way. If they're being labeled as people with mental illness or disorder, then they have the rights as people with psychosocial disabilities. Clearly, the other aspect, people who have been institutionalized for long periods of time, also in a similar situation, are also people with psychosocial disabilities. If they've been locked up because someone labeled them as such, then for the purposes of the convention, they are people with psychosocial disabilities. Now, what is psychosocial disability per se? Again, there have been many attempts at definitions. In one recent one, a few of us from different countries, different parts of the world, agreed on a definition that focused on an experience of discrimination related to a person's experience subjectively of psychic distress or disturbance in their consciousness, or to the attribution of such distress or disturbance by someone else. And the discrimination could include denial of supports, desired supports or accommodation, and it could also include segregation and violation of your physical and mental integrity. That's one way of approaching a definition. There's others. I think it's difficult because often it's a label that's applied to us rather than an experience necessarily that we can identify as a particular thing. So I think it's difficult, but I think it's something we can keep talking about.
Mais uma pergunta? Já temos? Alguém mais gostaria de levantar a mão? Fazer uma pergunta? Aproveitem. Tudo bem? Podemos encerrar, então, mais uma pergunta. Já temos ali mais uma pergunta. Já está chegando o microfone, por favor. Obrigado.
Boa tarde. Um breve comentário. O Brasil, ele tem uma história da reforma psiquiátrica muito importante nos últimos anos, né? E esse conceito ainda de deficiência psicossocial, para os militantes da reforma psiquiátrica, ainda é um conceito um pouco problemático, eu sinto. Eu fui trabalhadora de saúde mental. Por outro lado, eu vejo que ele pode ser um bom conceito para trabalhar a inclusão de algumas populações, como a promotora disse. A gente pode usar essa legislação em favor de algumas populações. Eu acho que esse é um conceito para nós que a gente precisa trabalhar, né? E eu percebo, já trabalhei na psiquiatria e hoje vejo situações de muita violência mesmo, né? Como a gente acreditando que estava fazendo o melhor e muitas vezes violando, como o Brasil violou por muitos anos, internando as pessoas, ou mesmo... E há um jornalista, né, Robert Whittaker, que tem feito um trabalho muito importante sobre a indústria farmacêutica, que capturou, a gente é capturado sim, né? Então é uma discussão ideológica, política muito importante. E a questão também de outras formas de abordar o sofrimento, né, como open dialogues, não sei, uma experiência em alguns países de não medicar, mas de conversar e de que nós ainda não temos alguns CAPs talvez tenham começado uma outra modalidade que é a gestão autônoma da medicação, acho que é GAM que se chama, né? Que as pessoas são elas se apropriam de entender a sua medicação e administrar a sua medicação. Então, são instrumentos de direito e que empoderam as pessoas que usam remédio, que muitas vezes não sabem nem para que está tomando esse remédio. Então, eu acho que essa é uma discussão que você traz, né, como sobrevivente da psiquiatria, que é muito diferente de um técnico falar, você provavelmente vive o outro lado dessa intervenção. Então, eu acho que a gente precisa ter mais debate sobre isso. Eu agradeço a sua presença e saio daqui muito mobilizada.
Thanks. I want to address two things in response to that. One, on the issue of psychiatric drugs, I think it needs to be a choice that the person makes. So if the person is being empowered to give themselves medication, they also have to be empowered to decide, do I want this medication or not? Is it actually making me feel better, or is it making me feel worse? And that people need to understand that the medication is not fixing something that's wrong inside their brain. It's something that's a psychotropic drug, like alcohol, like even cocaine, like, you know, whatever. And you're using it because of the effects that you want it to produce. So I think it's important to have true, free, and informed consent in relation to the drugs. And also, what you were saying about how it could be used with various populations as a basis for rights, that's essentially the way I come to that concept, the way I came to it. And there are other people who really strongly identify with the term psychosocial disability as a concept, that it really captures their experience. For me, it's more of a way of saying that the experiences of people in a psychic realm, in a realm where our internal experience is not matching the outer world, or where the outer world is not being receptive to what we need to communicate, that should be understood as a kind of disability from a human rights perspective. There's other senses in which I don't really identify with the term, that, and you know, there's ways that it can be even co-opted to become a medical model concept itself, just no different than mental illness. But I think it's clear from a human rights standpoint that we're included in the CRPD and that this concept of psychosocial disability being used by the CRPD committee refers to the people who experience themselves as having mental health problems or being mad, or who have been applied that designation by others. So it is for everyone, I think, a basis for the claim of human rights.
Ok, o tempo é exíguo, né? E nós vamos encerrar estas apresentações agradecendo a Maria Laura,